Hey everyone, Joey here, aka Animus, and today, as a Patreon request from AG Milky, I'm going to be reviewing the soundtrack to the game Disco Elysium by the band Sea Power. Sea Power, formerly British Sea Power, are an eclectic UK alt-rock band formed in the late 90s. They've put out a number of well-received records over the years, and their live shows are well known for being unusual in both performance style, visuals, and location. I've heard they once even played a gig in the Isles of Scilly, which you probably know has quite a special connection to me, so that was something cool and unexpected to hear. I'd heard of them for quite a while, but I'd never got round to checking out any of their stuff, so in preparation for this review and to give some background, I cast my eyes all the way back to 2003 and listened to their debut and kind of most renowned album, The Decline of British Sea Power. Despite the record's rough around the edges nature, or rather with its rough around the edges nature, I was impressed by its boldness and its metamorphic structure, opening with a stretch of frantic, noisy post-punk tracks, which then slowly melt into some more gentle atmospheric cuts. A great showcase of their rock sensibilities and unconventional songwriting. I'm looking forward to checking out some more of their stuff and seeing their progression over time as a band, but for the purposes of this review, we're gonna fast forward all the way nearly 20 years, 8 albums, and multiple lineup changes later, when they were tasked with creating the score to the 2020 detective RPG Disco Elysium. Now, I haven't played the game. This is the first time I've ever done a full review of a soundtrack on this channel, and it feels a bit unusual, especially when I'm taking the music just at face value. Though there is an art to compiling and sequencing an OST, and I'll pick apart the soundtrack kind of as if it were a regular album. It's important to acknowledge that these pieces were not specifically designed to fit within an LP experience, and I'm not really hearing these pieces in the context that they were intended for first and foremost. So just take some of my comments with a pinch of salt and remember that I am just looking at the music in a vacuum. Here they focus on an instrumental style most closely adjacent to post-rock, I'd say. I felt some notes of Godspeed You Black Emperor or Sigur Rós here and there. Much of the album is vaporous and atmospheric, focusing on guitars, strings, horns, electronics, ethereal voices, and expansive processing to craft a bleak backdrop for the events of the game alongside its seaside setting. And it's very successful in evoking this type of imagery. I often found myself picturing a place like Dungeness in South England with its otherworldly deserts of sand and stone. Unlike the experience of being in such places, this album has a sense of desolation and vast landscapes that reduce you to a tiny speck, though you can also find scattered moments of warmth and beauty, little islands of respite that prevent this atmosphere from being overbearing. Now, going in, I immediately noticed that as an album experience, it is quite unwieldy, stretching out over 28 tracks and 100 minutes of music. Though my patron very kindly chose to pay double for this reason, thank you very much. It is quite a lot to take in. Each time I've given it a listen, I have split it into 2 halves, otherwise I do feel I'd get a little worn out by the experience, particularly with how somber its tone often is. I find it much more digestible treated as a double album. It's also not the type of record I'll go through on much of a granular level. Naturally, the pieces mostly run together quite a lot and work to create an overall atmosphere without drawing too much attention to themselves. However, this isn't to say that there aren't moments that stand out or stuck with me after listening, so I'll go through some of the most notable individual cuts. Instrument of Surrender opens the album beautifully with isolated horns sounding out a melancholic tune as if echoing off the walls of a sea cave, before strings and a distant resonant guitar build into a dense cloud of somber ambience, while drums gently swell and crash like waves. I'm gonna mention the ocean a lot. Sea Power definitely do believe in the power of the sea. It's a clear highlight for me and definitely one of the most poignant moments in the overall soundtrack. And straight after, Whirling-In-Rags 8 AM seems to be the most well-known and well-loved cut on here. There's still a sense of melancholy, but it's one of the most gentle and inviting pieces here, with a soft drum machine running underneath a memorable guitar melody that's probably the most likely thing to stick with you after hearing the game's music, particularly since the track is reprised in two different forms later on, being the buoyant and almost danceable 8pm and the expansive piano-led 12pm. I was always happy to hear its motifs crop up again. Tiger King is powerfully evocative with hypnotic rolls and swells of instrumentation that do a great job at enveloping the listener. Speaking of which, tracks like this can just sound so immense on this album. Take a cut like the Insulindian Miracle, where vast amounts of reverb are used on a choir, somehow without ever feeling overbearing or muddying the overall soundscape. Elsewhere, Your Body Betrays Your Degeneracy is notable for its lurching, muffled booms of percussion, which lure you into a rather mesmerizing, perhaps almost ritualistic atmosphere. And Precinct 41 Major Crime Unit leans into folk influences with a driving triplet rhythm and prominent violins. Elsewhere, Live With Me brings in a gorgeous piano melody that later returns in Burn Baby Burn, underneath unexpected lilting vocal performances that build upon the music's imagery. The title track, parts 1 and 2, come together to create 10 minutes of some of the most sparse, drone-heavy material on the album that can pass you by a little bit in the context of listening to the whole soundtrack, but are pretty immersive and well crafted nonetheless. And then straight after, Ecstatic Vibrations Totally Transcendent is a massive change of pace, a full-on fuzzed-out dance cut with a four-to-the-floor thrum and buzzing synths shoved right to the front of the mix. Perhaps the soundtrack to a club scene? I don't know. It's a pretty jarring moment that snaps you out of the trance that most of the music lulls you into, though not a complete aesthetic or tonal shift. It's not a bad track by any means, and it certainly holds its own unique place in the track listing. Now, I have spent quite a lot of time focusing on the first half of the album, and with the way that the OST is sequenced, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure is just all the music from the game in order of appearance, the opening stretch of tracks does have more variety and ear-catching moments than later portions, in my opinion. Toward the end, I did feel like I was hearing some of the same ideas stretched on a little longer than I like to hear in a front-to-back album experience. Though again, of course, this music wasn't intended with that in mind. However, the closing pair of tracks are a very satisfying way to go out. Off we go into the wild pale Yonder, fantastic track title, utilises what I believe is a hammer dulcimer, building with distorted effects and bombastic drums into something far more striking and substantial than you're used to hearing. Bit of a banger at the end with a super hard-hitting guitar melody. There's definitely a sense of climax and finality to this track. I'd be very surprised if this doesn't play just as the end credits come in. Then I imagine ZAUM is what plays as the credits roll, with wistful but comforting ambience, feeling like the calm after the storm, before finally we conclude with a reprise of the very first track, really nicely bookending the album and, I imagine, the game. Now, for all my mixed feelings on the Disco Elysium soundtrack as an album, I definitely came out with positive feelings on what Sea Power were able to create here. This is clearly meant as a primarily atmospheric, ambient soundtrack that doesn't draw too much attention to itself, and feelings of the album running together are probably just an incidental byproduct of what I believe is the game's entire score being transferred to LP format. A small part of me would quite like a tighter, cut-down version, but overall I do feel it's right to put all of their work on the game out there, especially since a lot of in-depth craft clearly went into it, even in the case of the weaker cuts. If they were tailoring this music to simply be listened to on its own, I imagine they'd have far more moments of crescendo and urgency like I mentioned on the penultimate track. But as it stands, the Disco Elysium score makes for an expansive, pretty creative, and highly atmospheric listen that's easy to lose yourself in, and overall holds up well in the absence of the gameplay component. I feel it's not quite great as an album experience, but rock solid as a soundtrack, so I think overall my feelings balance out to about a 7.5 out of 10 on this one. Thank you for watching, see you next time.